Hi everyone, I'm making this video on the subject of what's called contemplative reading and contemplative writing. And I'm going to try and define what it is, although that is going to be difficult. It's difficult to actually make a very concrete definition of what it is, but we'll talk about what it is and to some extent how you can recognize it when it's happening or when it has happened, that contemplative writing or reading has happened. And it's essentially it's an approach to reading and writing that is, well, at least from my experience. So my experience is based on learning this from Naropa University, where the entire pedagogical model is based on what's called contemplative learning or contemplative education. And so there at Naropa, they apply this contemplative approach to basically everything. And that's something that could be possible at Naropa, but certainly in the realm of all of the reading and writing that you will be doing, one can take this approach. And it's a way that one can integrate two aspects of reading and writing. One is the academic aspect, reading and writing, and then the second is the personal aspect of reading and writing. And thirdly, it's going to bring in the transpersonal aspect. And this is the idea, so that the one comes up with a kind of, I would say, new form of reading and writing that is appropriate to a place like Atlantic University. Now, this may be something that you already do, but don't know that you do. And you may start to recognize it as I talk or when you do it. But it is a kind of within the realms of at least academic institutions, it's rather a distinctive, different kind of approach to reading and writing in this setting. If you go and look online, do a Google search on the words contemplative writing, you'll get a lot of different hits coming up. Many of the pages that you would go to will define it as more aligned with what I would call journaling, in the sense that they're advocating the kind of stream of consciousness writing that we often do in journaling. Writing where you write rapidly, you don't stop, you don't censor, you let the writing come. And that is journaling. It's not what contemplative writing is. And so to distinguish it from that, this is a much slower and more typically much slower, more deliberate kind of process of reading and writing. And it's much more akin to a well-known Christian contemplative practice, Christian monastic practice called Lectio Divina, which means divine reading. So, and that process of divine reading could also be applied to divine writing. So it's divine reading and divine writing. And Lectio Divina involves reading, say, a passage from the Bible or any other work of great, that you might think has great profundity, inspired work, where you read it, the work very slowly and stop frequently to think. So you might cogitate about what you're reading and try and understand it and work with it with your typical mind. But then you also have periods of quiet, which they call contemplation, actually. Periods of quiet where you're actually open to sort of receiving kind of inspiration and more intuitive messages about what you're reading and information about what you're reading. And then you might read particular phrases or passages over again many times in the process of Lectio Divina. So contemplative reading and writing are much more like that than they are like this sort of stream of consciousness, uncensored um, journaling, what I would call it. Now, on the other extreme, of course, so over here we have journaling. On the other extreme is what we call academic writing. And academic writing is much more sort of dispassionate, makes an attempt to be objective, to make reasoned arguments that are supported by citations and things like this. And we're all very familiar with that kind of writing because that's the kind of writing we were trained to do within the realms of academia when we were in it. And so this kind of writing is really aimed at not being personal. It's aimed at being impersonal, actually, objective, impersonal. And so that's on the other extreme from this sort of extremely personal journaling we've talked about. So there's two kinds of extremes of writing, and contemplative writing is really a means of integrating these two poles, such that you also bring in the transpersonal. So the idea of contemplative writing is that this sort of impersonal or objective, this highly subjective, and then the thing which sort of transcends this distinction kind of emerges in the process of that reading and writing. So the contemplative reading and contemplative writing is a kind of an integration and a kind of transcendence of that duality, that kind of distinction. And so that's what we're shooting for. Now, describing contemplative writing is actually not that easy. It's tricky, and because anything that involves the transpersonal tends to be difficult to speak about, at least in concrete terms. So I'm going to start out by trying to give you an example. So I've kind of laid a certain kind of background. And as part of that background, it's like you will have picked up that we're in a kind of deliberate, very considered approach to reading and writing, where one is paying attention, right? Inwardly and outwardly. One is paying attention. One is, if you would like, listening as you read and as you write. You're listening for this extra information that comes from within, as well as the information, of course, that comes from without. When you're reading, information is coming from without, but there's a process going on within as well. And you're listening for that. And then you're listening for the sort of still small voice, the intuition, while you're doing that process of reading. The same is true of writing. So, and really, in the context of Atlanta University, it's contemplative reading that automatically, or in a much more facilitated and kind of straightforward way, leads to contemplative writing. So that if one reads in this way, where one has paid attention, listen to the still small voice, you'll be set up for doing that kind of writing, because that information will have come into your consciousness and be available to come out on the page in the process of contemplative writing. In order to try and describe it, and try and make this distinction more clear, I'm going to use an example. And hopefully this is a good example. It's an example that I love, at least. And hopefully in the future I'll be able to come up with further examples, because I think that describing it is a kind of not particularly sufficient way of getting across what contemplative reading and writing is to you. And examples of it might actually be more appropriate or more communicative or better. So let's try this approach. So there's you're all familiar with Dante's Divine Comedy, the first part being Dante's Inferno. And at the very beginning of Dante's Inferno, he introduces the whole work by this one phrase, and there's various translations of the phrase, but it goes something like this. In the middle of the road of our lives, I awoke to find myself in a dark wood where the true path was wholly lost. Okay, in the middle of the road of my life, in the middle of the road of our lives, I awoke to find myself in a dark wood where the true path or way was wholly lost. Okay, so we could maybe sort of look at this from these different poles. A piece of writing, I say that this is a piece of contemplative writing. How do I know that? And here goes. So Dante is basically saying to us, so from the personal perspective, Dante is saying, you know what, in modern language, I'm having a midlife crisis, essentially. It's a very simple sort of, I suppose, primarily psychological statement. I'm feeling lost. I'm having a midlife crisis. Okay, well, simply saying that, of course, you can sort of hear the difference. That doesn't carry the weight of this particular phrase, in the middle of the road of our lives, I woke to find myself in a dark wood where the true way was wholly lost. Just, I'm having a midlife crisis would be this kind of sort of simply a personal way of describing that. On the other hand, the academic hand, which I haven't really thought about it's simply, well, one could be writing about the phenomena of the midlife crisis, and I'm sure it's a researched phenomena, and you could be citing papers about what happens to people and so forth, and that would be on this other side, dispassionate, not impersonal side. And so those would be the two poles, but that's not what happens. That's not what Dante does. Dante says this, well, definitely he says it poetically, but what has happened in the phrase that Dante did use is that he's ascended into a kind of archetypal realm. It's actually coming from what I would call the transpersonal, in the sense that the way Dante phrases it now puts you on notice that we're in the archetypal realm, in the middle of, and he says, in the middle of the road of our lives, I awoke. Why use the word "our" there for the collective? What this phrase does is apply to as a kind of universal. It's like, this is what happens. This is what happens to human beings. In the middle of the road of our lives, we awake. We might awake to find ourselves in a dark wood where the true way was wholly lost. So it's writing that has become archetypal. It's become of universal import. Right? It's now important across the board. Every human being is going to experience something like this. He is announcing that he's on a journey that is universal, essentially, archetypal, universal. In fact, of course, Dante's Inferno, Dante's Divine Comedy, is really an archetypal hero's journey. So, and he's setting it out that way. And from his perspective, of course, this is deliberate, but it's coming from a kind of integration of all of these possible approaches that we could have. And this is, in my opinion, how one begins to recognize contemplative writing, because what happens in contemplative writing is the merely personal and the merely academic get integrated and transcended, and in contemplative writing, the writing then becomes, although it contains the personal and it contains the academic, it becomes of universal import. Okay, it becomes, you stray into the archetypal realm, and this is not happening by intention of straying into the archetypal realm. It's happening simply by being contemplative as one approaches the writing. Of course, the same applies to reading, which we can talk about a bit more about later. So, in taking this approach, where one writes while listening to the still small voice within, or well, that and whatever is going on within, and concerned without as well, while one's writing with that kind of attention, that kind of awareness, this kind of writing happens. So the writing is a kind of a happening, not in the sense of writing as in the journal with a stream of consciousness, but in this very deeply meditative, contemplative, transpersonally oriented way. So we're not ignoring the academic writing, because what you're going to do is, because you're paying attention both inwardly and outwardly, one is going to include the outer material that you're involved with. Okay, one will include that with whatever citations is necessary. One will then bring in the personal that one would have, but these two get fused. They become something greater than a whole that's greater than the parts. And that's what happens when you do it in this way. You don't have to really try to do that. If you approach it with this kind of awareness, this kind of focus on attention and awareness, then that is the kind of writing that will happen. So you will include what's happened to you personally, perhaps back in childhood or whenever. That will come into it, and you can talk about it in conjunction with academic external material, and the two will come together to make this piece of writing that applies much more universally and has this characteristic of conveying a kind of powerful communication, a kind of powerful message. So, and again, this is not something to deliberately try. This is something that will just happen by going at it in this process. That because life consists of, at least ostensibly, of this very personal. I'm just having a midlife crisis. The academic, this is what midlife crises are characterized by. Life consists of these elements, right? Life consists of both of these elements, but not. We've separated these. What we're trying to do in this process is to bring them back together, to actually integrate them in a sense that, in a way that creates a holistic, that is, as I said earlier, greater than the sum of the parts, which basically it invites the transpersonal into the picture. Divine reading, divine writing. And as I said, divine reading, contemplative reading, sets you up for this contemplative writing. So when you're reading, as you will be in your courses, you'll be reading textbooks and articles and all kinds of things, watching videos. This can be done in a contemplative way, such that in this process of listening, using your awareness, noticing outwardly what the material is, inwardly what the reactions are and the responses are, and then even listening further for the still small voice, the intuition. When you're in that process, all of that information from this process of reading or watching a video will have come into your awareness. It will be available to you. So you've got this kind of unified information available for you. When you sit down to write, then you're sitting down with this arsenal, if you like, that's already available to you. So this is going to facilitate that process. But again, the process is to be writing while aware of those elements, the inner personal, the outer objective, the still small voice, intuitive still small voice. You're going to be aware of all those as you write, and so it's going to become a whole. The process of reading will merge into the process of writing, and it'll become kind of a whole. Now, this is obviously not a sort of simple ABC kind of technique, like grammar, which is needed, of course, and we have to have mastered the sort of basic rules of writing in order to go into this contemplative approach and have any hope of communicating this beautiful thing that we're bringing together, this beautiful integrated whole that we're bringing together. So the bones of writing, which is sentence structure, grammar, even elements of style, these are all still important, obviously, but we're transcending that. We're going further than that. Um, and that's what we're shooting for. And so it's really, I would say that it's, well, personally, I would call it a spiritual practice. So there's reading and writing becomes a spiritual practice, basically, um, in this mode of what we're calling contemplative reading, contemplative writing. So, so we're turning our lives slowly, slowly, slowly over into a life that is really a spiritual practice. In other words, this kind of thing will start to spread. It spreads from, and you're already, I'm sure, doing various kinds of contemplative practice and spiritual practice. But so this is part of the process of spiritualizing our lives in a sense. But in this case, at Atlantic University, what's required of you is a lot of reading and a lot of writing and other things too, but these can all be done in this contemplative manner as a kind of practice, a kind of spiritual practice. And this transforms not only the doing of them, but the output, the results of them. And in my view, this is a way one would hope for you to find a way to communicate not only at AU, but beyond AU, such that you communicate with actually great kind of power and focus, because it's integrated. All of these elements that need to be integrated, that in a way, in our culture, we've falsely separated things, objective, subjective, inner, outer. We've falsely separated these things, and without any particular transpersonal spiritual at all. So this is a way to, essentially an integrative approach to academia, and I hope it's useful to you. Now, there's probably more ways that I can go about explaining contemplative reading and contemplative writing, but I will contemplate how to communicate more about those things, because this is the thing that bears a lot of focus in order to really sort of bring it home. But what will really bring it home eventually, mostly to you, is the actual practice of it, the actual doing of it. And really, it is, I would say, mostly a form of attention practice, awareness practice. It's really that kind of thing. Listening inwardly, outwardly, and again, not censoring. So this is like an allowing in such a way that the outer information and the inner information become a whole, become integrated. And I hope to see the results of your writing in the future. Okay, thank you.